Good day, and welcome to this edition of the CFE Media Executive Interview Series. Today we'll be joined by Ken B. Adamson, Vice President for Plant Site and iTwin Services at Bentley Systems, the supplier of software and services for design, construction, and operation of infrastructure. I'm Kevin Parker, an editor with CFE Media. Welcome, Ken.
Thanks, Kevin. Morning to you, or afternoon.
Good afternoon. I guess my first question is simply, how has COVID-19 impacted the markets and industries that Bentley Systems serves?
So that's a very broad question, actually, because of course, we supply software throughout the world. So there's been a lot of regional variation to that response. It's kind of interesting, like in China, where they had their peak actually corresponding to Chinese New Year, which is traditionally a slow period from a work perspective. And so actually, when you look at the numbers, they came back pretty quickly, as they would normally do coming back from Chinese New Year. So you'd have difficulty looking at the data to say whether they were really impacted at all in a way. Whereas somebody like Italy, of course, they went into lockdown pretty severely. You saw much more a significant response there in terms of a downturn in work, as they went into lockdown. So it has varied quite a bit between regions. One of the things that we have kind of noticed is that because of those different circumstances, that behavior was also different. So assistance in places like India, where you don't have a typical work from home culture, they don't have the hardware at home to kind of work from home. So that had required a different response from, like in the US, where again, a lot of people have their home networking and home machines, as well as being able to bring their machines home. So again, you don't really notice a huge difference in that US market from, the day-to-day work from before, COVID kind of came into to be a factor.
That's really interesting. So, I mean, to start, you were kind of talking in terms of statistics, but in terms of your engagement with your clients or your customers on a day-to-day basis, did that more or less continue with the exception of some regions or not?
No, so we've had good collaboration. We basically did various outreach campaigns to make sure they were getting the assistance they needed from us. And we had a kind of, a Bentley Has Your Back campaign to help them kind of transition to the kind of more of the kind of homework environment, to set them up and to make sure they could be get up to speed for that. We've also increased the number of kind of our learning webinars. And we've seen like a 30-fold increase in the number of attendance of with those webinars. So where people may not have been able to work on productive projects, they have still looked at upgrading their skill set by learning and taking care of those classes or taking those online classes. So we've seen a kind of response on there too, where maybe they have been slowed down. They've picked it up by investing in training of their personnel and encouraging that. So we've certainly had continuous feedback from our accounts, both in terms of making sure they can kind of work from home, but also when they're at home, how do they make sure that they're being productive?
Good. It's interesting. Digital twins are really so much in the forefront of the technologies that are going to get us through the 21st century when it comes to infrastructure, when it comes to manufacturing, when it comes to equipment markets. And I know that the promised technology productivity gains of those technologies are, being presented as one way to help us all get over this downturn in the economy. Maybe you'd comment on that specifically, and then just talk a little more generally about how digital twins and the world of the coronavirus intersect at what points.
Okay, so I think the digital twin, I mean, part of that that it kind of connotes is also kind of moving to an online environment versus being on a desktop review. We've had desktop review, desktop collaboration tools, but being able to do it in a kind of cloud context it just makes it more accessible, especially, and more flexible in the situation that we're in now. So you don't have to worry about, do I have the right hardware horsepower at home in order to be able to collaborate with others? And the flexibility of the work setting. Obviously, people had set up collaboration rooms in offices, and so now you have a situation where you're not in the office. How do you still collaborate? So having the kind of cloud-based collaboration for that digital twin, so everybody can get on the same page of what's going on, see what others are doing, and yet to do it quickly and seamlessly without having to go through a lot of setup and configuration to make that happen. So that flexibility, I think, is really the key aspect that is maybe not obvious in the first light on a digital twin, but that flexibility in terms of how it gets deployed, who can collaborate, when they can collaborate, how they can collaborate, just has been kind of an eye-opener, just in terms of the way, the mindset that you think about that is certainly different from what it has been. So I think the general trend, though, having had COVID, to kind of answer your second part of the question here, is that the mindset change is also significant. That before, you may have promoted, or we might have talked about such a kind of collaboration workflows, but people were kind of reticent, reluctant to kind of step forward and make that change. Now they're kind of being forced to do this way because there's no other choice. And in so doing, they've realized that actually they can be more flexible, they can be less rigid about how they do things, they can be more informal in terms of those reviews, more of that kind of spontaneous pop-up review when you need to do it to collaborate. So I think that's a mind shift that's happened because of the circumstances. It's kind of forced people to make that mind shift, and I don't think we're ever going to go back. I think it is actually a shift in the way we approach the problems that you're seeing.
Right. And one of the big capabilities that are coming online is just more types of remote operations,
Right.
collaborating on criticality of equipment with multiple players coming from different locations and having a defined workflow so that and predefined interfaces so that the information is truly available.
Yeah, I think the key kind of takeaways in our mind is, okay, there's one is generally the openness. I mean, we've talked about openness in the past, but sometimes it's been difficult to validate, to actually quantify what is the kind of KPIs, what are the business metrics that you attribute with the kind of openness. And I think this is where you start to see an actual value in being open, because you can make this flexibility to be able to adjust quickly to different circumstances, to bring in new bits of information that you may not have otherwise had. So I think the openness is one. The general approach to flexibility to do, you were talking about, kind of prescribed workflows or prescribed interface points. But I think there's also just that kind of ad hoc. You want to do things, to a particular set of circumstances that you might want to review that may not have been kind of pre-programmed in, if you will, that you just want to, you think often occurs to you, so right, let me look at this factor or that factor. Well, to be able to do that quickly without having to go through, an IT configuration or go back to some, other group to say, I need to do a project to hook these things up together. So I think that's the other piece that is really kind of coming to the fore, is the flexibility in work processes that we also need to respond to. And those work processes, in a way, are almost becoming more personal versus kind of even group. So you do have to then deal with, how do you provide the flexibility that you want, but still do the checks and balances to ensure the quality of the product you've been producing, or the task that you're doing, to ensure that. So in the past, that quality was guaranteed by process and procedure. When you free up process and procedure, you need to think about, how do you ensure quality in other ways than you've previously thought about it. So I think that's, again, an interesting change in kind of how we have to respond to the market, given that additional flexibility.
Right. Well, that's very interesting. Finally, where do you think we're going with the global economy? I mean, I think that you must have your own point of view, and Bentley has, kind of, with your insight into their operations, you can kind of discern where they think might be going. But But I don't want to ask for proprietary information. What I do want to know is whether you think it's going to be a quick recovery, or how extended this is going to be.
So it's I have no crystal ball to be able to fully kind of predict that. But I think the actual kind of slowdown, if like, hasn't been that significant, to be honest. We still see people doing productive work. There's an initial kind of shock, shock to the system, so to speak. People have kind of come back individually, and companies have come back quite quickly to respond to that and get people productive again. I think where I think the longer term aspect is kind of more difficult to predict, because what's the consumer demand going to be in terms of new projects. So for the existing projects that are already in place or already scheduled or already funded, those have been continuing, and really there hasn't been a huge impact on that work. So the work in progress has continued, and it hasn't really slowed down. But future work in 18 months time, 24 months time, that's harder to understand. And I think that's more related to kind of global economic conditions as to what happens in 24 months time. But right now, for sure, I think people are still being productive, still are getting work done, and the economy, I think, is more robust than maybe otherwise some other, kind of, certainly within the engineering industry I'm referring to here, has certainly, I think, maintained the work that they have been doing. But as I said, I think it's more the 18 to 24 month. It really depends on the overall kind of macroeconomics as to what happens there.
Yeah, I think that describes the situation very well. That's all the questions I have for you today, Ken. Thanks for sitting down with us and for sharing your viewpoint with our readers and viewers. And to everyone else, thanks for tuning in. See you next time.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.